While we're getting Dr. Pimm mic'd up here, I think we should go ahead and begin. We are running a little bit behind and do want to get going. I'm Norm Christensen. I'm a professor of ecology in the Nicholas School of the Environment and Earth Sciences, and very, very pleased to be here today to celebrate this wonderful occasion. As has been pointed out many times, the Nicholas Institute is about policy solutions, and the sessions this afternoon are really dedicated to looking at particular issues and talking about the kinds of problems that the center might well want to put on its agenda. And so the idea was to have panel discussions and panelists who were eminently qualified to speak to those issues, but also to engage you with them to help us think about this. Now, an hour is in a short period of time, so I hope that this begins a conversation and that you'll take advantage of email, telephone, writing, calling, or whatever to follow up on this meeting. I think the only frustration I've felt today is that every session is just simply not long enough. This particular session is dedicated to the topic of habitat and forests, which is a obviously very broad issue. Think about a century ago, there were only 1 billion of us, and the world's forests seemed to be an endless cornucopia of natural resources, natural wonders, and natural beauty. Today, there are 7 billion of us who call this planet home. Very little forest remains that hasn't been somehow affected by human activities. Indeed, much of that forest is now gone forever, and even larger amounts appear to be headed in the same direction. Now, it's interesting, these changes might seem odd when we consider that over the same century, these same billions of people have come to understand that forests are critical to our survival. They shape our climate, they retain pollutants, they mitigate water flows, they sustain an enormous portion of the Earth's biological diversity, and very importantly, they inspire us. Our charge for this hour, then, is to discuss the future of forests and forest habitats. In a series of earlier email exchanges among the panelists and myself, we talked about potential questions, and I just want to throw these questions out. The panelists will address some, perhaps not all, but perhaps through the hour we'll have at least an opportunity to touch on them. One of the key questions is, what role can or should forest cutting play in habitat, biodiversity, and management? And implicit in that question is, what sort of cutting are we talking about, and how does the answer to this question vary among regions, among different forest types? In a world in which historic biogeographic boundaries have disintegrated, organisms, including ourselves, move freely, can we expect natural disturbances or human disturbances to produce sustainable results? Third question, the globalization of timber markets, changes in the technologies for wood fiber utilization, patterns of human development on landscapes are transforming the incentives for the use of forested lands here and globally. What is this likely to mean for future forest habitat, both on private and public land? Fourth question, with the third question in mind, how do we ensure that decisions that we make regionally that appear to be, and probably are, very sustainable, are in fact also globally sustainable, or that we aren't simply exporting problems from one place to another? And finally, and relevant to so many discussions, particularly related to climate change, forests are included in virtually all of the schemes that we have to control carbon emissions. And I think we might want to use this opportunity to think about the pros and cons of inclusion forests in carbon emission systems, such as cap and trade programs. What is the benefit of those kinds of programs, and is there, in fact, are there potential downsides, particularly from a habitat standpoint? As I mentioned, the panelists have been invited to speak to these issues, one or several. They may well choose, in fact, I suspect that they probably will choose to talk about others as well. So let me just move on to, first of all, I have to say that I'm honored to be up here today with this very distinguished group. Honored in many ways. They also happen to be wonderful friends. I'll introduce them in the order in which I would like them to talk. Jack Ward Thomas, on the far right, is the Boone and Crockett Professor of Wildlife Conservation and the Director of the Boone and Crockett Wildlife Conservation Program at the University of Montana. He started his career with degrees from Texas A&M, West Virginia, and ultimately University of Massachusetts. When Jack's name is mentioned in various circles, several descriptors usually come to mind. Certainly, innovation and creativity describes the enormous body of scholarship that he's developed. When I first met Jack, he was in fact Chief Research Wildlife Biologist and Project Leader at the Blue Mountains Research Lab in La Grande, Oregon. During those years, he published over 200 papers on a variety of topics ranging from the biology of elk, deer, and turkey, to wildlife disease, to songbird ecology, to the ecology of the northern spotted owl, and to land use planning. The second descriptor that comes to mind for Jack is, I guess I could say, plain spokenness. I've had the privilege of serving with Jack on a variety of different advisory committees, and I've always been impressed with his wisdom and his ability and willingness to express it in uncertain terms. I happen to have been part of a panel some years ago that Jack wasn't on, but was invited to advise us, a panel dealing with the ecology and management of the Sierra Nevadas. At that first meeting, Jack sat down and he started out and he said, well, the biggest problem you guys have is you've got too much money and too much time. That was an incredibly wise thing. It turned out to be totally true, as a matter of fact. The final descriptor that comes to mind is leadership. It was no surprise to anyone that Jack was asked by President Clinton to chair the process that would ultimately produce the Pacific Northwest Forest Plan. Not long after that, Jack was asked by the same president to become the 13th chief of the U.S. Forest Service. The tone of Jack's tenure was set by his own words. We don't just manage land, we're supposed to be leaders, conservation leaders. Among his honors, Jack is a recipient of the National Wildlife Federation's Conservation Achievement Award and the Aldo Leopold Medal from the Wildlife Society. Stuart Pimm holds the Doris Duke Chair in Conservation Ecology here in the Nicholas School of the Environment and Neurosciences. He also holds an appointment, this is a wonderful title, of extraordinary professor at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Prior to joining the faculty, Stewart held positions at University of Tennessee and at Columbia University's Center for Environmental Research and Conservation. A native of England, as you'll pick out as he begins to talk, he graduated from Oxford and then subsequently received his doctorate from University of New Mexico. Now, the extraordinary professor thing actually is quite apt. The depth and breadth of Stewart's conservation research and conservation leadership is truly extraordinary. He's currently working on endangered species and ecosystem restoration in the Everglades, doing research on a set of priorities for the protected areas in the Atlantic coastal forests of Brazil, doing research to predict the timing and location of current and future losses to biodiversity worldwide, not to mention significant work on endangered species in Madagascar and South Africa. His research covers the reasons why species become extinct, how fast they do so, the global patterns of habitat loss and species extinction, the role of introduced species, the management consequences of this research are incredibly important. He's the author of several influential books, including The World According to Pimm and The Balance of Nature, Ecological Issues in the Conservation of Species. And
all available on the bookshelf.
Yes, you'll find them right outside. Actually, each of these gentlemen, I'm not sure if Tom has his books out there, but I saw Jack's book out there as well, which is a wonderful, wonderful set of memoirs related to his years as chief. So in fairness to the entire, and shameless advertisement. Our third panelist is Tom Lovejoy, and Tom's impact on the world of conservation has been nothing short of transformational. Since his undergraduate and doctoral work at Yale University in the mid-1960s, Tom has maintained an active research program in the Amazon of Brazil, one of the longest running studies of tropical biological diversity out there. He's done all of this while holding a list of leadership positions, beginning with the World Wildlife Fund in the early 70s, Assistant Secretary for Environmental Affairs and Counselor to the Secretary of the Smithsonian Institution in the 80s. He was Science Advisor to Interior Secretary Bruce Babbitt during the Clinton administration, and then moved to the World Bank, where he was Chief Biodiversity Advisor and Lead Specialist for the Environment for Latin America and the Caribbean. And during that time, Senior Advisor to the President of the United Nations Foundation. In 2002, Tom became, I should say, the Executive Director for the H.I. Heinz Center for Science, Economics, and the Environment. As I said, Tom's impact on conservation has been transformational. Among his innovations, he originated the concept of debt for nature swaps and founded the public television series Nature. In 2001, he was awarded what I think most of us would consider to be the ecological equivalent of the Nobel Prize, the prestigious Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement. So we have a wonderful panel. I've already said way too much, although I could not say too much about each of them, and I would invite Jack to lead off, and we'll simply go through each of the others, and then I will open the floor for comments, questions, and repartee.
Okay, my intention is to talk about forest in the United States, and particularly in the western United States. Very clearly, those forests are beginning to shift from being managed for the production of wood and wildlife production to the management for visual impact or preservation of biodiversity. The federal forests are subject to less and less management of any kind because now, given the interaction of the environmental laws of the 1970s, the cost of assessment, analysis, planning, court review, appeals, there's almost nothing can be done that doesn't cost more to wind up to do than you get out of it in the end. As a result, the Forest Service has been reduced from 43,000 people 9 years ago to less than 30,000 today, and continuing to decline. Now, that cut from the National Forest declined from about 13.5 billion board feet in 1990, which was way too much, to about 1.5 billion board feet today, which is way too little. And the odd thing is, it doesn't seem to make much difference which political party holds power. The political party in power today and the undersecretary over the Forest Service used to harass me endlessly when I was chief about getting the cut up, and he spent the night with me a couple of weeks ago, and I said, Mark, you've been in power 5 years and it's still going down. So there's something quite significant going on besides what political party holds power. The large timber companies, essentially, they want to maximize their profits, and one by one they are selling their lands off to land development. Boise Cascade, a very, very good timber company, recently sold all their lands, which is being other lands people that bought it are now peddling it. And they're not peddling it to people who are going to grow trees on it. That's the best sites, low elevation, are being sold basically for huge house lots of 300 to 500 acres. And so that land that was in production is now in ranchettes or home sites. And the owners of smaller tracts are similarly inclined. So those things are coming about. Now, those are in fire regime forests that are burned periodically. Depends on where you were, how frequently. The fire regimes are low ground fire. Then there's a mixed intensity, which is some ground fire, some canopy fire, and then the catastrophic or stand replacement fire. And all of these sites, having been protected from fire for a significant period Forest Service did a very good job of that. Now it's incredibly overgrown and very subject to fire. Now, what's happening? People are building houses out there in the middle of that. And so the United States, the government, has wisely decided to pass the Healthy Forest Restoration Act in order to spend hundreds of millions of your dollars to make it safe for those people to live in the middle of a fire regime. So about the only attention that's going on now is that sort of action of thinning inappropriate urban forest interface areas to prevent catastrophic fire. That's got some really interesting problems to it. And so the only trouble with this is people have a tendency to view the forest as static. It isn't. It's changing constantly. And disturbance ecology is now getting to us. We have more fire, bigger fires, and hotter fires than we have ever had before. Simply those fires, once they're beyond several hundred acres, given the conditions in the woods today, are very apt to jump to several 100,000 acres. Just to give you an example of what's going on, we're active in the urban forest interface, which means we thin the trees to the extent that we can return ground fire, so we won't burn up people's houses. But somebody missed the boat. You thin the trees out, lets more water and more sun to the forest floor, which means it goes back at relatively low elevations to production of winter range, which means you got deer and elk flooding into those areas, followed by black bears, grizzly bears, and cougars, which gets rather interesting when you get a call that says there's a mountain lion sitting there twitching its tail looking at my kid waiting for the bus. It gets a bit exciting. So in terms of the federal lands and others, the timber industry is essentially downsizing itself. Most of the small mills are now closed. The big mills remain in action, not apt to return given the federal land situation, no matter who's in power, because they want certainty of supply, and that is very, very uncertain and very apt to not happen. So what are the foresters being trained to do? Obviously, for most of the lands now in the West, traditional forestry doesn't work. That is forestry for the production of wood products. Go lay out a new 300-acre clear cut and see how far you get. Clear cutting works beautifully to produce timber. Or you go into group selection or single tree selection, etc. Mostly these things now, to retain visuals and to retain wildlife habitat, are simply not an appropriate silvicultural approach. So now everybody's beginning to wing it and trying to figure out what kind of forestry they institute in order to retain the visuals and retain the wildlife.
Thank you, Jack. Stewart?
I want to sort of take this from the other end, the far scale of worrying about your child being eaten by a mountain lion. If you look at the world's ice-free land surface, about half of it was once forested. Of that half that's forested, the other half is what you might call drylands, areas that are grasslands, deserts, savannas, things like that. So if you take the half of the world's Earth's surface that was once forest or woodland, about a quarter of that we have converted to agriculture, to croplands. And about half of what remains is tropical moist forests, rainforests if you like, plus tropical dry forests. Those areas are shrinking at an extraordinary rate. The world's tropical forests have been reduced by half, and they have been reduced by half mostly in the last 50 years. Such that, to follow from my good friend Jared Diamond, by the time that my kids are of retirement age, my girls are at retirement age, most of the world's tropical forests will have simply disappeared. Those global changes are not only a challenge to us at an institution like NEIPS, because we feel that we have a global concern, not just a national one, but they affect us at the national level in all sorts of interesting and important ways. We know that from global warming, that a major cause of global warming comes from greenhouse gases, which we create by burning fossil fuels. But 25% of all greenhouse gas emissions come from land use change, most of which is our destruction of tropical forests. So in the sense that there is more greenhouse gases, and they are being created by land use changes, which is mostly deforestation, and it's the greenhouse gases and the global warming that has exacerbated the problems in the Gulf with all these hurricanes. I have to tell you that I have a home in Key Largo, and my garden, I'm told, is not very pretty at the moment, so there's quite a deep layer of debris across it. These actions come home to us as American citizens, worrying about what we're going to do about all of it. That's just one of, I think, a couple of important mechanisms that we have to address on this very large global scale. The other, of course, is that the single biggest driver of biodiversity loss, biodiversity, as Tom Lovejoy invented the term, is the total variety of life on Earth. And that variety is shrinking such that we will lose somewhere between a quarter to a third of it if we don't change our actions to date. So what's happening in the world's forests, not just our American forests, but the world's forests, greatly reduces the variety of life that we enjoy, at the same time has surprising and very unfortunate consequences in our daily lives. Now, there's obviously a connection. If we are cutting much less lumber in the United States, does that mean that globally lumber construction is down? No, unless I'm very much mistaken.
You're right.
It's going up. So we have to say, where is it going? What are the changes? Some of those changes you might think are relatively benign. It's because we're growing more timber plantations around the world. Probably 1 million square miles of the planet are now covered in timber plantations. But they're not always in the places we'd like them to be. As a part-time South African, I know that large areas of the South African veldt are now being covered in trees such as Monterey pine and eucalyptus. So we're having those kinds of impacts globally as we try to take up the slack. And of course, if we cut less timber, other timber-hungry nations, including ourselves, will begin to look to the remaining forests to perhaps even accelerate the damage we have done so far. So for me, one of the exciting challenges of the new institute is to look at these north-south and south-south interactions of how timber is being exploited in Brazil. If there's less of it there, does it mean there will be more plantations in South Africa? And the north-south dialogue that says if we're cutting less forest here, what is that doing to the Amazon? What is that doing to the places that hold this extraordinary repository of our environmental heritage, of the incredible variety of life on Earth?
Great. Well, thank you, Stuart. As I looked at the title of this session, it said Habitat and Forests, not Forest Habitat and Forests. So that gives me a license to skate out a bit further into the dry land or the above sea level land of the planet. And you probably will not have heard much about it, but a very important report was concluded a few months back called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, a term which is, not going to sing and will cause people's eyes to graze over. But when the time comes, and it should not be an if, when the time comes that it's actually translated into something which is accessible to anybody outside of specialists, it does not paint a pretty picture of what is happening to all the different kinds of ecosystems of the world and to the kinds of services that they provide, whether it's generating soil fertility or pollination or watershed management, the great global cycles, or indeed disaster prevention, such as the intact mangroves in the area of the tsunami last December provided by reducing the impact of the tsunami, et cetera. So just want to flag that for you for when it does become available. It'll give you a great overview of the serious dent we're making into the fundamental ecology of our planet. Climate change is the subject of a different panel, but it definitely interacts with our subject. If I did have a book out there, it would be my latest one on climate change and biodiversity, and it comes about 13 years after I did the first one, and there are huge differences in our understanding of that subject. And first and foremost is that you can already see nature responding to the climate change which has already taken place. So that's changing flowering times, changing nesting times, changing migration times, changing geographical distributions of some species, and the beginnings of system change, such as in the oceans. And I know I'm treading on the territory of yet another panel where the oceans are already becoming acid simply by absorbing some of the elevated levels of CO2 in the atmosphere, which in turn will have very serious implications for all organisms that depend on the calcium carbonate equilibrium to build their skeletons, such as corals. Beyond that, I think it's also important that as we think about all these problems which are generated by our own activities, that one of the major ways that we express them and we measure them is through economics and markets and some of the kinds of things that Jack was referring to with respect to forests in the United States. So, for example, probably the single best predictor of the annual rate of deforestation in the Amazon of Brazil is simply the state of the Brazilian economy. And while a very strong argument can be made that when there is political will, Brazil does control it, that's relatively rare, and on all other occasions, the state of the economy is a major driver in what happens there. And most recently, you could even get more specific about it and refer to the commodity prices worldwide for soybeans, which are either increasing the rate of expansion of soybean agriculture into the Amazon or slowing it down. So one very wonderful thing about the new institute is the ability to integrate sort of the economic aspects of the drivers into exploring possible solutions to reduce our impact on the environment. I'd like to make two final points. One is that there are these enormous global cycles like that of carbon, which obviously we're disrupting not just through fossil fuels, but as Stewart mentioned, through the conversion of living tissue into CO2, which in the case of Brazil would move it from being about number 17 emitter in the world to about number 4 or 5. And they also include cycles of nitrogen. And that's already seriously out of balance, as was referred to already today. About twice the amount of biologically active nitrogen is now available as is the natural level. And really sort of the first symptom, if you look at the globe from a distance, is the existence of dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico and other estuaries around the world where a lot of the nitrogen that is coming from our various activities, but principally agriculture, end up and seriously create low oxygen zones where little life can live. So the big cycles will be part of what the Institute needs to look at as it seeks solutions to diminish our impact. The last point I wanted to make is I spent Friday, Saturday, and Sunday at a meeting of most of the specialists on amphibians in the world, on frogs and salamanders and other kinds of amphibians. And as a group, amphibians are in more trouble than any other, not just by a little bit, by a lot. Literally 1/3 of all the species of amphibia in the world are threatened. And it's a complicated story. Habitat destruction is still the major factor there, but there are a whole variety of other things, including climate change, including toxic substances, including a fungus which is sort of spread around the world, in part because it just got a free ride on the backs of the species of frog which was used for pregnancy testing in the 50s and 60s. And what we're seeing is something that none of us successfully envisioned as we were looking ahead to the beginning of this extinction rise. And it's not that we didn't realize that the different things that we were doing could have sort of synergistic effects greater than the sum of the parts. We just had really no way to take it to any quantitative level. We could say, got to look out for that. But we're seeing it now with the amphibia. All these things are coming together, and they're knocking the amphibians first and foremost, perhaps because they're the most sensitive group of vertebrates. But I think it's just the first of similar phenomena to come. So that's a tough thing to take on, but at some point we're going to have to look at how to model all these things together, because if you're an organism, all these things come and impact on you. I mean, biodiversity in the end integrates all these environmental problems. So we'll need to develop a capacity to take it on at that scale. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. We don't have an awful lot of time, but I think the best way to use our time is simply to open the audience. I'll try to be aware of where hands are up and direct questions. So it's your turn. Sally?
I'd like to ask Stuart and Tom, particularly about, and I guess everybody in town, biodiversity specialists in their own way. But your project with the Florida panther, is that your project that's crossbreeding with the Texas cougar? In terms of biodiversity, what does that do if you're introducing a species that wasn't there to begin with, to strengthen a species that's losing its gene pool? Is that preferable to losing a species altogether because of its role in biodiversity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hugely privileged. For about 40 mornings a year in April and May, I watched the sunrise from a helicopter flying across Everglades National Park. I have to be in my flight suit with my flight helmet on just as it's getting light. So I watch the sunrise. And they get dropped off at various places in the middle of the Everglades. And it is an amazing experience. I feel hugely privileged to get to see a part of the park that no tourist can go to. I know there are panthers out there. I know that in some very tiny way they pose a certain amount of risk to me. But I feel that the world would be, Everglades would be, a much poorer place if we didn't have them. Okay, some of those cats now have, in fact, probably most of them now have a Texas mum or a Texas grandma. But it would be awful. I mean, I'm always reminded of that line from Dorothy's line from The Wizard of Oz. Lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Can you imagine writing that if there weren't lions and tigers and bears? So yeah, for me, keeping the panther going is important. I think there's a broader message in that. And that is we can save biodiversity if we put our mind to it. there are things we can do as a nation to protect these endangered species. The fact that we have bald eagles and we have peregrine falcons and grey whales is a consequence of the Endangered Species Act. And if I might make a plug, we as a nation are about to debate that tomorrow, in fact, in the House Resources Committee, a bill that might come to the floor of the House as early as next week for a vote. If that version of an Endangered Species Act had been passed in 1973, we would not have bald eagles in the lower 48 states.
Well, I mean, I just think in that particular instance, it is a very reasonable thing to do. And the genetic distance is not huge.
The reason I ask is because in the Galapagos, they're so purist about, making sure that tortoises at certain islands stay on those islands and they don't mix them with the other islands because they're trying to get back to the purest
Absolutely.
form of diversity on those islands.
That's the right thing to do in that circumstance.
I'd like to respond, not about panthers, but for example, the federal forest of the United States, the driving force now is preservation of biodiversity. That's not the mission, et cetera, but that's what it's evolved to be. And that's a very clear thing. And, we're somewhat dedicated to that in order to save a subspecies of owl and the habitat upon which it depended. There are probably about 6 biologists that ever seen one of. We shut down the timber industry in the Northwest. Lost 35,000 jobs initially and another 25,000 later. So that forest is largely devoted to the preservation of biodiversity. Unfortunately, in order to do it, it's going to require some management because all of this stuff is building in a very strange, non-normal way. And there's no way out of it except to manage it. Just let it stand there and get thicker and thicker and thicker and then burn in the catastrophic stand replacement fire that are much larger and much hotter than existed normally. So we're now up against it. In order to retain biodiversity, we're going to have to manage to get it.
And that's probably true globally as a generality.
It's going to have to be managed. It's not going to just happen.
Let's see. Question in the back. There are lots of hands, but yeah.
I'm just thinking of the Rita sitting out in the Gulf right now. And in 1993, because of loss of habitat, the Mississippi floods, our beaver dams, wetlands, the mangroves on the tsunami, the Indian crest, that habitat's compromised. Maybe there's a relationship between Katrina and between New Orleans and the Gulf, the whole coastal estuary and the decline. I'm wondering if this new center being proposed here, that'd be an issue. There are no centers that I know of that have really taken an interdisciplinary look at natural disasters from a social, biophysical perspective and that linkage. In the whole notion. These are habitats. San Diego, New York, Miami.
Yeah. Well, it's not 100% true that it hasn't been looked at because my own center has looked at some of those situations. But generally speaking, and it's been one of my pet peeves, they're always called natural disasters, right? And thank you very much. Nature's only responsible for part of it, and we set the rest of it up. And it's actually been quite encouraging amidst the horror of it all to see that being recognized in the case of Katrina. What you do about New Orleans, it's a really tough question because 80% of the annual deposit of silt that would get down there and provide for rebuilding some of those wetlands and in the barrier islands and the rest is trapped every year behind dams on the Missouri River. We really set ourselves up with a difficult situation there. But I would say there's a broad area here in terms of how we should relate to our coasts. that needs all the best minds in the world working on it.
If I dare talk about forestry, nobody's mentioned this much, but that hurricane just flattened a couple of jillion acres of timber, or trees, pardon me, timber, trees. But when the hurricane came in New England in the 30s and just flattened most of the trees in New England, and they salvaged that. These things, just because they occur at very long intervals, they occur all of the damn time. You know, how many times has this happened in the past? And Columbus Day storm that took down about 16% of the old growth in the Pacific Northwest. These kinds of fluxes in the system are quite normal. And we need to quit,
The mitigation functions, like the mangrove forests.
I don't know much about mangroves,
Yeah.
but the Columbus Day storm flattened a forest, a huge number of trees that were 300 to 500 years old.
Well,
So maybe the pulse is at 300 to 500 years, but still it's there.
There is an area which of inquiry which would be really fruitful and pay off, I think, quite quickly. And that is when these storms end up, as happened just 3 or 4 years ago in Central America and Honduras, and you had all that terrible flooding and mudslides and the rest. There really needs to be a very precise study which shows how much deforestation contributes to making that a worse event than it otherwise would be, because it gets into an argument where one side says, well, when it rains that hard, it doesn't matter whether you have forest or not. Well, I don't think that's true, just from the anecdotal evidence of places that had forests and had fewer floods and mudslides, but it really needs to be quantified.
You know, the comparison, just to punctuate that, the comparison between the same tropical storm effects in the Dominican Republic and Haiti last year.
That's right.
And the tragedy in Gonaives is a great example. I mean, if you ever have the opportunity to see those two countries be in them, the big difference is forests one place, no forests the other.
But
Yeah.
I'd like to just add one very quick, and it's not really a funny anecdote, particularly if you play golf. There's a country club in North Carolina called Elk River Country Club, which I suspect is probably dominated by Republicans, although I cannot confirm that. They haven't been able to play golf there for over a year because of the hurricanes last year, which destroyed a fair bit of the golf course. So before we all sort of start thinking about poor people in Honduras and Central America and poor people in New Orleans, we should think of the poor golfers at Elk River.
We're running, let me just make a comment, we're running short on time. I'm going to continue this until I get a high sign from somebody who comes in and says, you got to clear out of here. So let's see in the very back, and then we'll move down here. Lark?
I had a question on domestic forests and at the risk of seeming very provincial, eastern forests of the United States in particular. And it seems to me that there is so much focus when we talk about domestic forests on the western United States. From where I sit, a lot of the biodiversity resides in the forest in the eastern U.S., the southern Appalachians being the closest example. And my question is, do you think that there's been an inappropriate inattention to eastern forest issues in terms of domestic forests? And if so, what might you advise those of us who do share that view to do to try to bring some attention to forest land loss in the east? Here in North Carolina, in the last decade, we lost 1 million acres of forest land to development. We've got some situations that need addressing, but the attention always seems elsewhere.
I think I can tell you why the attention is elsewhere. That's where the public lands are. Everybody owns a piece of that, and so everybody got something to say, and that's where they jump in. That's also where the politicians can operate cheaply relative to the forest. You know, you can make a deal and let people off the hook on private land. We'll concentrate it on public land. So I think that's one of the reasons in the difference. The other is that whatever species you were going to lose, you probably lost them. And the Endangered Species Act is not coming full bore to bear in the eastern forest like it is in the west. And I would certainly agree with that. But everybody's got to go somewhere. And you can watch the timberlands, and they're going to start to sell out for development as well. And simply that's the highest and best use. And unless there's some revolution in thought or some ability to deal with those questions, that land is going to go to the person that's going to pay the most for it, and it's probably not going to be you or me.
Let's see, a question over here.
One of the issues that cuts across many of the different ecosystems that we've discussed today is the role of invasive species. And that's a fingerprint of human activity that is, like you did mention the fact that this frog was moved around and its disease has accelerated the decline of things that we couldn't predict. So I'd like for you guys to each talk about maybe your vision in terms of how invasive species and development and human management feeds back into this topic.
Well, I'll just start off, and I know the others have things to say. I mean, there's no question that it's a huge problem. It's not just a terrestrial problem, it's even a marine problem. A lot of stuff gets transported in ballast water, and that's probably the most easily solved by finding ways that you can essentially sterilize ballast water. And it's a really tough thing to control because a lot of it is not deliberate. Most of it's not deliberate. As I understand it, a corn borer moth flew into a troop equipment carrier being loaded in the middle of the night here in North Carolina and ended up in Europe, right, a few years ago, and now they have corn borer problems. And 10 years ago there was virtually no attention to this except little bits here and there in the federal government. There's now a pretty active invasive species sort of interagency group, but it falls far short of what needs to be done.
It is one of the interesting areas where there's broad bipartisan agreement. And the invasive species have a huge economic impact on the agricultural sector, some on forestry. A lot of different players don't want things coming in. Now there are interesting debates. Horticulturists want to bring in every last plant and don't like being told no. So you have the bizarre situation that in the state of Florida, that there's an agency that is encouraging the importation of water hyacinth, and another agency that's trying to eliminate it. So I think the issues are hugely interesting, but at that kind of scale.
Well, just to make an example, we've got research in forestry going back a long, long way. All of a sudden, much of the research done 50 years ago simply doesn't apply today in terms of regeneration or stand tending because the ecosystem is not the same system that it was studied before. We've had invasions that totally changed the situation. And so our research background that was leading us to make certain decisions in forestry is now defunct because the ecosystem itself is now different. Those plants are here and they're not going away. And so we're actually having to do things over again under the new system. And God knows what the next invasive will be that causes you to have to readjust again. And there's not much that you can do about it. I'm making the thing about the urban forest interface. We thin it, produce this new situation. The ground stirred up. What do? We get exotic plants. People have to deal with that. You can't burn it. It's too close to people. It makes them nervous. You can't treat it with herbicides because they're worried about having 6 fingers on their kids, legitimately so probably. And so it's just a constant. You'd think at this time we'd have forestry down to a fine science. We literally are having to reinvent it to deal with all of these new questions of what do we want out of the forest, which is something different than what we used to want, And we also have ecosystems that are changing. Climate patterns are changing. It's something that's really in flux. You know, when I was an undergraduate, you learned how to either clear cut it or selectively cut it or group selection, and that was pretty simple. Now it takes some really struggle to keep up with the ideas of what are you managing for and what can you really do in a changing system.
We can take one more question, and then we'll probably need to disperse here before, because the next group is going to come in and want this room, so.
Do you have figures on what percentage of the frog population has died off? I know in the Adirondacks you don't see the way one used to.
Can't give you the numbers for the populations, but there are places where it's really been sort of as you described.
Or would it be down 50%?
I don't know the answer. In certain places, yes, specific places, but overall, I can't tell you.
Half the world's species of amphibians live in an area smaller than the District of Columbia. That's small an area. In fact, most of the world's
But not
amphibians-
altogether.
Not altogether. most amphibians have a range the size of, or smaller than the District of Columbia. Some of them have a known range, a large fraction of them, about 20%, have a known range about the size of this room. And when you are that rare and that local, you are extremely vulnerable to anything that can go wrong.
Fortunately, they don't all of them live in that small area together, which is about us. We'll take one more down here, and then,
I was wondering, we spend a lot of time on Forestry, and I think it's particularly the West, and how that problem might translate elsewhere in the world. And what do we do about it? I think the purpose of the Institute, as I understand it, will be to sort of get the science right, and then let the policymakers understand what that right answer is, and then see if we can make it happen. So what might the right answer be in the case of Western forests as they affect rainforests and other places? What might the Institute, how would you see it as a sort of mini case study here in terms
Okay,
of
well, I spent
how we do that?
37 years in Forest Service research before I became chief of the Forest Service. And we're just fanatical now about the best science. My God. Let me tell you what, when you start to do that, when you start to look at science applicable to forestry, it's not just silviculture, it's an incredible array of stuff, and it's all in different little pockets and patches. Then you have to learn how to fit that together, and nobody's trained in how to do that. If I was going to be innovative and I had a place like this school, I'd be training some students in integration. How do you integrate knowledge from a whole array of guilds? The next thing to keep in mind is this drives politicians nuts. But you got to understand that 50% of peer-reviewed literature is simply wrong. That's the scientific process. Test this, get that answer, try again, sharpen it up, and then you look back and I saw it scared the hell out of me because it came out of the medical literature where this biometrician had published this thing and said 50% of current literature is wrong, in whole or in part. But that's how we learn, and scientists know that. Politicians just want you to give me the damned answer, plus or minus 5%, and they don't relate to science at all. Now, there's also in the current administration, Forest Service research has been cut in half. Why? It causes too much trouble. If you don't know about these things, you don't have to react to them. If we had never studied spotted owls, in theory we would still be out there whacking away. No, we wouldn't. We would hit the wall over some other reason. But if you don't do research, then you don't have to react to the consequences.
Let me give you a really quick solution from my end of the business. For $5 billion, you could buy out logging leases on the world's major tropical forests. And to do that, you would cut global emissions of carbon by about 20%. That is an incredible deal, an unbelievable deal, an extraordinary deal. And the reason that we haven't been able to implement it is because the devil is in the details, and it's solving those details that we could make a huge impact on with the school.
I don't know where you come up with that number of $5 billion, though, because if that's just the legal logging. If, for instance,
it's buying out.
You couldn't, for $5 billion, you couldn't buy Arthur Daniels Midland and Cargill and Urumaji from cutting down the Amazon for soy production.
Oh yeah, you could.
For $5 billion?
For five, I
I
think,
doubt it. They make more than that in selling the soy.
we'll have a sidebar on that.
So make it 10.
Tom, I'm going to give you the last shot.
I just did.
Obviously, this conversation could and should go on. At the risk of overloading my email box, let me put my email address up here, and I really do invite you to send those questions. Stewart and I in particular are going to be heavily involved in moving this issue forward with the Institute, and we really welcome your ideas. So please do communicate with us. Enjoy the rest of the day, and thank you.